Welcome to lecture 3 of this series of lectures, talks on metaphysics. And today is the continuation of the subject of Parmenides. Parmenides, one has to, in a sense, understand this is an extraordinary leap in philosophy. The first huge step that we know of in this poem, because what Parmenides has done is give us a vision of being that it is claimed comes from the goddess, where that vision is extraordinarily different, but coherent, different from what we would normally think of our view of the world. It's as a sort of portrait from a goddess point of view, or God's point of view, if you like. It's an extraordinary idea. What is it? It's the idea that being is a unity. It is what we would now call a monistic view. There is one thing, being. It includes everything. It includes everything that is. One can't speak about what is not. What is not capable of coming into being, not capable of going out of being. It must always be, and as we see it, it must be continuous so that there can be no gaps in it, because those would be gaps of nothing. So it is, as it were, filled up from, what can one say, edge to edge, top to bottom. It is being. And it is one thing. It does not change. That whole thing does not change. It is an eternal unity. Now that's an extraordinary vision to come to a philosopher at the very beginning of philosophy. To start it off, as it were. It's not what most people would normally expect from this. And that's the significant thing. In the third part of the poem, the goddess outlines to Parmenides what the human view of the world is like, the view of opinion, which is not the view of truth. It is our attempt to understand the world, and it is a fragmentary, piecemeal attempt to put together the evidence that we have to make something that is understandable to us. And it is at enormous variance from the vision that has been presented as the truth by the goddess. So, what are we to make of this? In particular, if you go back to looking at the argument that I presented last week, you can see that almost all of the argument is being driven by this idea that nothing cannot be spoken of. And it's that gives you the idea that it must be a continuous unity, a continuous whole. Nothing cannot be spoken of. And as I pointed out at the end of the last lecture, that does sound odd, because isn't the goddess talking about nothing in saying that nothing can't be spoken of? Isn't she doing just that? Isn't Parmenides doing just that when he conveys to us in the poem what the goddess has relayed to him. It's paradoxical, and it's called Parmenides' paradox. Let's take an instance of this. Santa Claus. Now, Santa Claus does not exist. Sorry to break it. How then do we say what I just said, namely, Santa Claus does not exist? This is the essence of that paradox. It becomes a paradox in language. When you try to say that you can't speak of nothing, when you can't speak of that which is not, you have to speak of that which is not. So when we say, as we want to truly say, that Santa Claus does not exist, how do we make sense of that? We seem to be using a name, an expression, which is a name, Santa Claus, and we seem to be using it to say, truly, that Santa Claus does not exist. But if we can't speak of what is not, how do we say that it is not? How do we say of Santa Claus that Santa Claus doesn't exist? You see, it looks like we're using a referring expression, Santa Claus. Normally names refer to things. Well, it looks like we're using a referring expression in order to say that the thing that we are referring to doesn't exist. But if the thing that we're referring to doesn't exist, then the referring expression doesn't refer to anything at all, and therefore it's empty. So does this empty name have any significance in the sentence, Santa Claus does not exist? That is the essence of the problem, and I'm not here to say that it is a simple or an easy or an obvious problem to solve. How would one solve it? Well, here is just a suggestion that might have some merit. What one could say is that when you say Santa Claus does not exist, the way you should say that is rather differently. You should say the name Santa Claus has no referent. It doesn't refer to anything. The name Santa Claus has no referent. Doesn't refer. And that is tantamount to saying that Santa Claus doesn't exist. You see? Santa Claus, the name Santa Claus has no referent, has the same content as saying that Santa Claus doesn't exist. But saying that Santa Claus doesn't exist uses the name in a referring way. And if we can't do that, we have to resort to what you could describe as a sort of pulling back to a different level. Instead of talking about Santa Claus, which Santa Claus doesn't exist seems to do, we instead talk about the name Santa Claus. Because even if Santa Claus doesn't exist, the name Santa Claus exists. We use it all the time. And so, when we say Santa Claus doesn't exist, we can report that more accurately without referring to something like Santa Claus by saying the name Santa Claus does not refer or has no referent. And that would be sufficient. Or would it? Is there a loophole in that? Well, someone might say, I suppose, that when you say the name Santa Claus has no referent, that doesn't by itself entail that there is no Santa Claus. It entails that the name Santa Claus doesn't refer to Santa Claus. Perhaps there is a being, Santa Claus, that is not referred to by the name Santa Claus, but that would nevertheless exist. Does that make sense? Well, then we come to the very tricky question of, well, in what sense does the name Santa Claus pick out any entity at all? If we say that it doesn't refer, we are saying that it doesn't refer to anything. Could there nevertheless be things that are not referred to there that nevertheless do exist? As you see, the whole idea of retreating to this level of semantics seems to be a way out, and perhaps it is, but you can see that it also invites all sorts of tricky, odd questions. However, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, because once you get into semantics, you're also getting into how to paraphrase all of this sort of thing in a sort of logical way. And we haven't got to that idea yet. In some sense, we're at the level where the Greeks were at, where Parmenides was at. And there is no sense that Parmenides is trying or is thinking about how to cash out what he's saying, what the goddess is telling him, in any kind of logical form. The logical form, in a sense, comes later, around the time of Aristotle, for example, but it's not present earlier. What we have from Parmenides is a much more abstruse and undigested, if you like, vision from the goddess about what being is like. And it's a powerful vision, but it's not in even Parmenides and Parmenides' pupil, which is Zeno, don't attempt to cash this out. Now, I should say one thing about Zeno himself. Zeno's paradoxes in some ways are trying to give a mathematical flesh to the idea that is in Parmenides' poem. Remember, in Parmenides' poem, one of the ideas was that change is not possible. From the goddess's point of view, there is no change in being. So Zeno has arguments to show that movement is an impossibility. One can't think of things moving. Instead, one has to settle for the Parmenidean picture of a universe that is static. Movement becomes, well, what? This is a furtherance of the Parmenidean paradox in some ways. If movement doesn't exist, then how do we explain the fact that we are moving all the time? What does that amount to? It amounts to an illusion that the goddess wouldn't be subject to. She wouldn't see things as moving. She would see things, as it were, from a four-dimensional viewpoint of just things, as it were, following lines in time, viewable from the viewpoint of eternity. Is that what she would see? Or Are we meant to think of this in some other way? So Zeno's paradoxes did present us with interesting, beautiful, logical puzzles, the first real logical puzzles that we have from the ancient Greeks. But we would need, in a sense, modern maths in order to try to come to terms with them and to understand them. And that came much later. One anecdote that we have about Parmenides and Zeno is that when Parmenides was a very old man, he and Zeno, as a young man of distinguished appearance, we are told, visited Athens for the games, I think, for the games it's said, and were visited in their abode in Athens, where they were put up, were visited by a very young Socrates, who listened to the disquisitions of Zeno on his paradoxes, which he had brought with him, and which they were then hearing about, as it were, from the horse's mouth for the first time. This had a powerful influence, we are told, on the young Socrates, and it may well have been one of the things that determined that he become a philosopher. If not the first thing, then something that may well have settled him on his course. Parmenides, because Plato took from Socrates some of Socrates' interests, and had others of his own, of course, but had some of Socrates' interests, one of the major talks that Plato gave, or dialogues, is called the Parmenides. And in it, Parmenides in some sense, confronts Plato in Plato's own vision and offers refutations along the lines of Parmenides' own logic. And this may well be a playing out of what perhaps Socrates might have thought about Zeno, hearing Zeno's paradoxes when he heard them for the first time as a young man. Zeno, at that point, may have been a slightly older man, but not an old man, as Parmenides was. He was a young pupil of Parmenides. But apparently he impressed. He impressed the young Socrates. He impressed all who met him. That's an interesting thing to have in front of us, I think, when we imagine these people. Okay.